I've never said no, I've never said yes. No, I'm not. But the main... I'm never gonna dance again. Guilty feet have got no...
Everyone saw the smile, the perfect jawline, the golden tan, the voice that melted through radio waves like silk. To the world, George Michael was the picture of confidence, the man who had everything: fame, love, and a voice that could stop time. But that day on live TV, something broke. It wasn't during a scandal, it wasn't on stage, it wasn't even in the chaos of paparazzi flashes outside his home. It happened under bright studio lights, in front of a cheerful interviewer who was supposed to be asking about his music. George leaned forward, relaxed, ready to promote the album that had made him one of the biggest names on the planet, Faith. Then, out of nowhere came a question that wasn't on the list. The tone changed. The air went still. "George, are you gay?"
George, are you gay?
Am I gay? It's a pretty direct first question.
He froze, just for a heartbeat, and for the first time, the confident pop idol looked uncertain. The world saw a smile, but behind that smile was something else. Pain, confusion, maybe even betrayal, because that one question, broadcast to millions, would follow him for the rest of his life. In that moment, something changed. The audience saw a celebrity politely dodge a question, but George saw something darker, a trap he'd never escape. He laughed it off, of course, because that's what stars were trained to do. But after the cameras stopped rolling, those who were there said his face turned quiet, his expression empty. And according to one rumor, whispered years later by someone in the studio that day, he muttered, "They'll never ask about the music again, will they?" Whether he said it or not, it felt true. That day on live TV marked the beginning of a lifelong mistrust, a moment when George Michael realized that not everyone pointing a camera wanted to hear his song. But what exactly happened in that room, and what did he say off camera that still sends chills today? You're watching RetroWaves, where the hidden stories behind music's greatest legends finally come to light. If you believe that the truth behind fame is often more powerful than the spotlight itself, then hit subscribe. Give this video a like and stay with us as we uncover the day George Michael's trust was broken. Because behind every headline, there's a human story. And this one is about a man who gave the world his voice, but lost his peace to the cameras. Stay till the end, because what he whispered off camera might change the way you remember him forever. It was 1988, the year George Michael became unstoppable. His debut solo album, Faith, had exploded across the charts. The world wasn't just listening, it was watching. From the sleepless neon streets of Los Angeles to the crowded corners of London record shops, everyone knew his face. He was no longer just that handsome boy from Wham. He was the pop icon of a generation, the man who could write, produce, and sing his own #1 hits. But fame, as George would soon learn, has two sides. One is the applause, the other is the silence that comes after it, when the lights dim and the questions begin. In public, George played the part perfectly. He was witty, charming, magnetic. In private, though, he was deeply sensitive, almost painfully so. Friends and collaborators often said he was thoughtful to the point of overthinking everything. He worried about lyrics, about meaning, about honesty. He once said, "The bigger you get, the more they take away from you." At the time, few understood what he meant. When he walked into that Australian TV studio to promote Faith, George expected the usual talk about success, maybe some banter about his image, his sound, or his sudden superstardom, but he didn't expect that question. The reporter's tone wasn't cruel, it was almost casual, but George instantly knew what it meant. It wasn't curiosity, it was invasion. In the 1980s, sexuality in pop culture was treated like a scandal, not a conversation. One wrong word could end your career, and though George wasn't living a lie, he was living in fear, not of who he was, but of how the media would twist it. So when the interviewer asked, "Are you gay?" George gave a calm, careful answer. "I've never said no, I've never said yes, but no, I'm not. I don't think it's anybody's business." It was the truth, but it wasn't enough. Within hours, tabloids across the world ran headlines questioning his identity, mocking his privacy, and twisting his words into something scandalous. The story wasn't George Michael releases record-breaking album, it was George Michael dodges question about sexuality. He was furious and hurt. He'd worked his whole life to be respected as a musician, and now the world was only talking about what he wouldn't say. That single interview became a symbol of everything George Michael feared about fame, the invasion, the judgment, and the way the media could turn honesty into ammunition. And though he'd go on to release more music, win more awards, and fight back with art that spoke louder than headlines, he never truly forgave that moment. Because behind the cameras, George Michael wasn't a star defending an image. He was a man learning that the spotlight could burn. But what really happened after the cameras stopped rolling, and what words, spoken off-screen, would follow him for the rest of his life. When the cameras started rolling that day, George Michael looked like the man who had mastered fame, perfectly styled, confident, calm, the kind of celebrity who seemed untouchable. But if you looked closely, there was a subtle tension in his eyes, the quiet look of someone trying to hold a mask in place. The interview began normally. Talk about his success, his new sound, his whirlwind rise since Faith topped the charts. He joked, he laughed, he played along. The audience adored him, but then the tone shifted. The interviewer leaned forward with that familiar smile TV hosts wear when they're about to drop a question designed to make you flinch. And then, with no warning, came the line, "George, are you gay?" It wasn't said cruelly, it was said casually, even playfully, but to George, it was like a blade slipped between sentences. He paused, just for a second. The cameras caught the faint hesitation, a flicker of discomfort before he smiled again. "I've never said no, I've never said yes, but no, I'm not. I don't think it's anybody's business." He tried to laugh it off, but something in his voice wavered. Behind the camera, one of his team later said, in an unconfirmed recollection, that George looked away briefly, as if searching for help. When the segment aired, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Headlines screamed that George Michael was hiding something. Tabloids twisted his words into insinuations. A single question became a week's worth of mockery. What was supposed to be a celebration of music turned into a global guessing game about his private life. And George, who had always prided himself on being open in his art, felt completely exposed by the media. In that one moment, he realized something devastating. It didn't matter how talented he was. To them, he was a headline first, a human second. Rumor has it that when the cameras stopped rolling, George turned to someone nearby and said quietly, "They'll never ask about the music again, will they?" That quote was never verified, but it captures what so many close to him described later, the deep disappointment that replaced his once playful relationship with fame. From that moment, the smile we saw on TV wasn't the smile of confidence anymore. It was the armor of a man learning to survive in an industry that demanded his soul but disrespected his silence. After that interview, George's relationship with the press began to deteriorate, slowly, painfully, and publicly. He didn't lash out, he didn't make statements, he simply began to withdraw. He still appeared on TV, still gave interviews, but they were shorter, more controlled. He stopped giving personal answers. He talked about melodies and messages, not relationships or rumors. Journalists began to notice the shift. He was polite, charming, but distant. Gone was the George who used to joke freely with interviewers. Now his guard was always up, and who could blame him? Every time he tried to talk about music, they turned the spotlight back on his private life. They wanted labels, they wanted drama, they wanted vulnerability, but only when it could sell papers. George, who had written some of the most heartfelt lyrics of his generation, was suddenly treated as if he were a puzzle to be solved, rather than an artist to be understood. In one verified interview years later, he said, "It's strange to realize that fame doesn't protect you, it isolates you." That sentence summed up everything he felt. He didn't hate the media entirely. He hated what it had become, a world where truth didn't matter as much as shock value. By the early 1990s, George was beginning to take control of his image. When Listen Without Prejudice Vol. 1 came out, he made a radical choice. He refused to appear in his own music videos. He didn't want his face to be the story anymore. He wanted the focus back on his songs. But even that act of rebellion only fueled more speculation. Some thought he was arrogant. Others said he was hiding. Few realized he was simply protecting himself. That single TV moment years earlier had taught him one thing: the more honest he was, the more they twisted it. So he built walls, quiet, invisible, but strong. He told friends later that fame was like being hunted by people who smile at you first. That quote is real and haunting. And what came next would prove it wasn't paranoia, because just when George thought he had learned how to control the media, he discovered they could still betray him, even behind the camera. What the public didn't know was that George Michael had been given clear boundaries before that 1988 interview. According to verified production notes and recollections from people involved, his team had specified no personal questions. The focus was supposed to stay on Faith, his songwriting, his creative process, and his artistic freedom after Wham! But during the live segment, someone on the production team allegedly decided to break that agreement, thinking it would make good TV. It did, but it also changed the way George saw journalists forever. When he realized what had happened, his face fell. He finished the interview professionally, thanked everyone, smiled for the last camera flash, and walked out without saying a word. Backstage, one crew member recalled that he seemed stunned, quiet, almost numb. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, he just looked disappointed, not angry, but wounded. That's the thing most people don't realize about George Michael. He wasn't just famous, he was sincere, and when sincerity meets betrayal, something inside you breaks. Years later, a friend would describe that day as the moment George realized the media would never protect him, and from that day on, he never trusted them again. Now here's where the story takes a darker turn, and while this next part was never confirmed publicly, it's been whispered by those close to the production for years. Rumor has it that after the interview ended, George turned to someone off camera and said something under his breath that still chills people to this day. "They'll never let me just sing again." We can't confirm he said those words, but his actions afterward make them hauntingly believable. Because in the months that followed, George Michael stopped doing press tours altogether. He focused on music and on silence. That interview didn't just hurt him, it redefined him. It turned one of the most open, hopeful pop stars of the 1980s into one of the most cautious artists of the 1990s. And while the world saw a man who looked calm under pressure, the truth is, he was already starting to pull away from the very world that had made him famous. But this wasn't the end of his story with television. A decade later, George Michael would return to TV in a moment no one expected, and finally he would speak about what that betrayal had done to him. And what he said then proved that the wounds from that first interview had never really healed. For nearly a decade after that moment on Australian television, George Michael stayed cautious. He released timeless music, Freedom, 90, Jesus to a Child, Fast Love, songs filled with emotion, pain, and coded truths. But the man behind them stayed quiet. When he spoke, it was through lyrics, not interviews. He once said, "My songs say more about me than any journalist ever could." And for a while, that was enough. But silence has a way of becoming its own story. By the late 90s, the media was circling him again, not for his music this time, but for something far more personal. In 1998, George was arrested in Los Angeles after what police described as a lewd act in a public restroom. It became an international sensation overnight, his privacy stripped away, his name splashed across headlines in bold letters. Every talk show, every tabloid, every gossip column treated it like the scandal of the century. For most people, it would have ended their career, but George Michael wasn't most people. Instead of hiding, he did something shocking, something no one expected. He faced the world head-on. He agreed to go on CNN, to sit in front of a camera again, to tell his side of the story. After 10 years of silence, he was going back to the one place that had caused him the most pain: television. People close to him were nervous. They knew how much he hated the media, how betrayed he'd felt years before. But this time, George wasn't the same young pop idol who smiled through discomfort. He was older, bolder, and ready to reclaim his voice. The man who once said, "It's nobody's business," was finally about to explain why. And when that interview aired, the world saw something no one expected. Not shame, not excuses, but strength. The interview aired in 1998 on CNN, hosted by journalist Jim Murray. It was the first time George Michael had spoken publicly since the Los Angeles incident. Millions watched. He looked calm, almost serene, but his words carried years of frustration. He wasn't there to apologize for who he was. He was there to confront the culture that had cornered him. "I don't feel any shame," George said, looking directly into the camera. "I feel stupid for being reckless, but I don't feel shame." It was the kind of honesty that had been missing from celebrity interviews for decades. There was no spin, no PR-approved language, just a man who had finally had enough. He spoke about the hypocrisy of fame, about how the same media that praised him one day tried to humiliate him the next. "The media is a real demon," he said plainly. "I'm angry at the way it treats people, not just me, but anyone it can use." Those words hit differently because they weren't coming from a man at the start of his career, but from someone who had already lost faith in the machine. Many fans didn't realize it, but this was the moment George Michael took back control of his narrative. He refused to let the tabloids define him. After the CNN interview, something remarkable happened. The shame they tried to pin on him turned into power. The same press that once mocked him now had to quote him. It was redemption, not in the public eye, but in his own heart. Still, what most viewers didn't see was how hard that interview was for him to do. According to people who knew him, George had been hesitant until the very last moment. He reportedly told a close friend, "If I do this, it's for peace, not for them." And he was right. That interview didn't fix his relationship with the media. It just allowed him to finally tell the truth, his way. But beneath that calm tone, something else lingered. Because while George had learned to speak again, he had never truly healed from the moment that made him silent in the first place. After that CNN interview, fans saw a new version of George Michael, fearless, open, and finally free from pretending. But freedom, for him, came with a cost. He told The Guardian years later that he had stopped believing fame could protect anyone. He said, "Once they've decided what story they want, that's all you'll ever be." It was a quiet admission of something deeper. He no longer believed in the media's ability to tell the truth. And who could blame him? For years, every article about him seemed to focus on his personal life instead of his artistry. When he released Outside, a defiant, upbeat response to his arrest, critics called it a comeback. But to George, it wasn't about coming back. It was about taking ownership. It was his way of saying, "You can't humiliate me, not if I turn it into a song." That same year, he told another interviewer that he'd stopped reading tabloids altogether. He said, "I realized I was feeding my own pain by trying to see what they thought of me." Even though he had every reason to be bitter, George Michael still carried himself with grace. He never named names, he never sought revenge. He just withdrew, slowly, quietly, from the circus he'd once ruled. Fans noticed that his interviews became rare, almost sacred. When he did appear on camera, he spoke softly, but with unmistakable weight in his voice. There was wisdom now, and sadness too. In one of his last interviews, George looked back on his career and said, "I don't regret the fame, I regret how it taught me to distrust people." That line says everything. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of smiling through pain. Tired of the cameras that once made him feel seen, but eventually made him feel small. The world had taken his openness and turned it into entertainment, but that day on CNN, just like that day in 1988, proved something about George Michael that no headline could erase. He was always honest. He just learned the hard way that honesty comes with a price. And though he kept creating, kept performing, and kept giving the world his music, those who knew him best said he never fully recovered his trust. The cameras gave him fame and took his peace. And that's why, even today, what George Michael said off camera still sends chills. The moment that changed George Michael forever didn't end in that studio in 1988. It echoed through the rest of his life, in the way he moved, the way he spoke, and the way he protected himself. In the years that followed, fans noticed something subtle in his interviews. Every time a reporter asked a personal question, George would smile politely, pause, and then shift the topic back to music. It wasn't arrogance, it was survival. He once said in a verified interview, "The moment you give them too much, they stop listening to the music." That wasn't just a line, it was a truth he had learned the hard way. By the early 2000s, George had stopped trusting television entirely. He preferred radio interviews, where words weren't edited for effect. He would rather let his voice, not his image, tell the story. And yet, ironically, that painful experience gave him some of his most beautiful art. He poured every ounce of heartbreak, frustration, and vulnerability into his music. Songs like Praying for Time and Freedom 90 weren't just hits, they were warnings. Warnings about fame, judgment, and the way the world treats its heroes. He wasn't just writing pop songs, he was writing confessionals wrapped in melody. Years later, when he released Through, one of his most introspective songs, fans felt it instantly. This was George speaking to himself, not the world. He was still trying to find peace with the man in the mirror, and the cameras that never stopped watching him. One journalist once wrote that George Michael had a soft defiance, the courage to smile while standing in the ruins of his privacy. That description couldn't be more accurate. Because no matter how many times the media tried to control his story, George always found a way to reclaim it, through music. Still, there's something haunting about that 1988 moment. When you watch it now, the brief pause, the flicker in his eyes before he answers, you can almost feel the weight of everything that would follow. It's not just the question that lingers, it's the silence after it, the silence that became a symbol of how fame can twist something pure into something painful. And what he said off camera that day, the words that have echoed for decades, weren't about sexuality or scandal. They were about disappointment. Because George Michael had believed in people, he had believed in the beauty of connection, and what he learned that day was that not everyone holding a microphone wanted to listen. In the end, George Michael's story isn't about scandal or secrets, it's about trust. It's about what happens when the same light that makes you visible also blinds you. When every word is recorded, every silence analyzed, and every emotion turned into a headline. But here's the remarkable part, he never let that darkness define him. Instead, he turned it into art that still comforts millions today. When you listen to Praying for Time, you hear his disillusionment, but also his compassion. When you watch the video for Freedom 90, with the famous supermodels lip-syncing his words, you realize he wasn't hiding. He was sending a message, you can have the fame, I'll keep my soul. And he did. He lived the rest of his life on his own terms, private, imperfect, and beautifully human. Even when tragedy found him, he left behind a catalog of songs that feel more honest than any interview ever could. There's an old rumor, never confirmed, that in his later years, George once told a friend he wished he'd never said yes to that interview. If that's true, it's easy to understand why. That single TV moment meant to entertain had changed the way he saw the world forever. But in another sense, maybe that's exactly what made him George Michael. The vulnerability, the truth in his voice, the quiet strength to keep singing even after the world tried to silence him. Because George didn't stop talking, he just changed how he spoke. He stopped using interviews and started using songs, and those songs will outlive every headline that ever tried to define him. Every time we hear his voice today, in Careless Whisper, One More Try, or A Different Corner, it still feels personal, because it was. Every note carried pieces of the man the cameras never understood. That's why when you look back at that 1988 interview now, it's not just a moment in pop culture, it's a mirror, a reminder of how easy it is to forget that behind every icon is a human being, just trying to be heard. George Michael once said, "The truth is like a song, it will always find its way out," and that's exactly what he did. Even when silence became his protection, his music remained his truth. The cameras took his peace, but his voice became his revenge. And decades later, what he said off camera still sends chills. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was real. He never needed to say much, he just needed to sing. You've been watching RetroWaves, where music's greatest stories are finally told the way they deserve to be. If George Michael's story moved you, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which artist's truth you want to hear next. Because behind every legend is a moment the world was never supposed to see.